Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I was genuinely surprised that one lawyer allowed me to serve on the jury, let alone two. If I were trying a case, I would never allow a lawyer on the jury. I explained this to my fellow jurors when they sensibly suggested I take on the role of foreman. There's a good reason to avoid having a lawyer on a jury, I said. When legal issues or matters related to the proceedings come up, people tend to defer to the lawyer's opinion. It's easy for their perspective to carry more weight. That's even more pronounced if you make the lawyer the foreman. They're likely to dominate the deliberations. Instead of 12 people combining their insights and judgment, you risk ending up with just one voice. I'd rather stay in the background and contribute like everyone else. Come on, Jack. Do you really think we're such pushovers that we just go along with whatever you say? Sarah Reynolds chimed in, a 38-year-old teacher and housewife with 2 daughters. We all lead our own lives and make our own decisions. We're not going to let anyone bulldoze us. That's not what I meant, I clarified. I wouldn't want a doctor on my jury in a medical case either. There are things he knows that the rest of the jury doesn't. People would naturally assume that if he interprets something a certain way, he's probably right. Certainly more likely to be right than they are. I have complete confidence in this jury, and that's exactly why I don't want to do anything that might even slightly compromise our decision-making. I think I managed to ease their concerns about my intentions. In the end, we elected Vince DeMeo as foreman. Vince was a pharmacist, and while I wouldn't have wanted him on a jury for a case involving drug reactions, this was an attempted murder trial, and as far as I knew, he had no personal connection to the subject. This was exactly what I hoped for. The chance to observe and understand how juries arrive at their decisions, knowledge I could apply in the future when arguing cases in front of them. Bless those 2 misguided lawyers who allowed me on this jury, not because they made a clever choice, but because it served my own goals. That was how I felt as we sat down to deliberate. But what unfolded was a series of unexpected moments that taught me more than I ever could have imagined. My first surprise came from the jury's assessment of the attorney's professionalism and effectiveness. Heading into deliberations, I thought both lawyers had done a solid, workmanlike job. Counting myself, that opinion was shared by exactly one person. The prosecutor, Stephen Bishop, had called Garrett Crowley, the victim, to the stand to recount his near-death experience. Mr. Crowley, could you please tell us what happened on the afternoon in question? Bishop asked. Crowley leaned forward, speaking with a folksy frankness. Well, I'll be the first to admit, I ain't no angel. I was with Irene, in her bed, and we were, engaged in relations. Different style, I was on top. I didn't hear nobody come in, so I figured we were alone. Then, all of a sudden, there's this loud bang, and splinters of wood are flying off the bedpost. I raise up, turn around, and there's her husband, Leon, standing there with this huge, this monster gun in his hand. That got my attention real quick. He says, "You've been chasing after my wife, and other wives, for a long time, and now you've finally found a husband who won't put up with it." Then he raises the gun, points it at me, and fires. He hit me square in the chest, but somehow, the bullet didn't go in. And he sneers, all smug-like, "You're a lucky man, a misfire. Think it could happen twice in a row?" Well, I saw what that first bullet did to the bedpost, so I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I just jumped up and ran like hell, didn't even try to grab my clothes. As I'm tearing down the stairs, he's shouting after me. I grab my keys off the table by the front door, bolt out to my car buck naked, and peel out of there as fast as I can. And later, I talked to Irene, Garrett continued, and she told me he said I'd better not show my face again because I know what he's willing to do to me. No objection? That's hearsay, clearly intended to prove the truth of a threat allegedly made against him. Is Leon's attorney even paying attention? Garrett provided a few more details and some background before Leon's lawyer finally sprang into action. "You said you were engaged in relations with Mrs. Granger," he began. "What were you doing? Plotting to become relatives?" Objection. The prosecutor interjected. "He's trying to insult the victim instead of asking questions. I'm simply inquiring about his smarmy affairs and predatory behavior," Leon's lawyer replied smugly. At this point, the judge began pounding his gavel, trying to restore order. But it seemed neither attorney had much interest in decorum. They were more intent on squaring off against each other like combatants in a personal grudge match. Leon's defense attorney, Blake, yes, that's his real name, and no, you can't make this up, took a dramatic turn, comparing the prosecutor, Stephen Bishop, to the Soviet secret police. "He's trying to jail a man for doing nothing more than attempting to save his marriage," Blake declared. Not to be outdone, Stephen, who insisted on going by Steve to sound more relatable to the jury, shot back, Blake. Blake will say anything to put a homicidal maniac back on the street. The courtroom devolved into shouting until the judge finally bellowed over the noise. In my head, I'd started referring to him as Judge Andy because the trial was beginning to resemble a small-town variety show. If you two don't settle down, he warned, you'll both be in jail before the defendant. A clever turn of phrase, sure, but also problematic. The defendant was out on bail, so was the judge inadvertently suggesting to the jury that we should find him guilty this early in the trial? Blake began by asking Garrett how many husbands had been willing to put up with his behavior. Steve immediately launched into another objection, starting to list all the issues with the question, but Judge Andy cut him off and warned Blake that he was skating dangerously close to the line. Blake rephrased. Isn't it true, he asked, that you frequently pursue other men's wives behind their backs? Objection, Steve said firmly. Beyond the scope of direct evidence, irrelevant and immaterial. Blake countered smoothly, Your Honor, I'm questioning the witness about acts of deception. Acts that involve lying, sneaking, and covering up the truth. Surely such behavior, if confirmed by the witness, directly calls into question his credibility, which this jury must evaluate to determine what happened and who to believe. Steve didn't have much to say after that. It sounded like a solid argument to me. I found myself wondering what Judge Andy had for breakfast. Overruled, the judge declared. Probably something very healthy. Blake wasted no time, grilling Garrett about 3 other married women before Judge Andy finally intervened. We get the idea, he said sharply. Move on. Blake shifted tactics, asking Garrett if he ever considered the lives he was destroying or the homes he was wrecking. Steve objected, but Blake plowed ahead as if no interruption had occurred, pressing Garrett about the children affected by his actions. Steve shot back, accusing Blake of disrespecting the court, while Blake countered that Steve was trying to protect scum of the gutter and enable their disgraceful acts against decent, law-abiding citizens. Not to be outdone, Steve retorted that Blake would represent any slime willing to pay him. Finally, Judge Andy, slow on the uptake but getting there, banged his gavel and reminded both attorneys how this was supposed to work. You make your objections to me, he said sternly, and I'll rule on them. It seemed to me that Blake had landed some solid points about the victim's character and had thrown Steve off his game. But later, during our discussion in the jury room, it became clear I had missed the bigger picture entirely. That Blake man was just awful, Mrs. Horowitz said, her distaste evident. I don't trust anyone who'd hire a lawyer like that. She wasn't alone in her opinion. The sentiment against Blake was shared by several jurors. We were supposed to be evaluating the defendant, yet somehow the defense attorney's behavior was influencing our perception of his client. The benefit of the doubt was slipping away from the defendant, not because of the evidence, but because we didn't like his lawyer. That other lawyer wasn't much better, Mr. Cruz chimed in, but I felt bad for him when Blake got him so riled up. At least he's just trying to enforce the law. I couldn't help but feel surprised. The jury wanted the lawyers to be nice and polite. This wasn't the British judicial system, where civility and decorum are the norms. In our adversarial system, we're trained to come at each other with everything we've got. But perhaps adversarial had come to mean nasty. Lesson number 1. The jury is more inclined to favor the lawyer they like, and by extension, their client. Sarcasm and a harsh tone don't win any points either. Boy, am I going to have to make some changes. Irene takes the stand. Blake makes a token objection, citing marital privilege, but Judge Andy quickly dismisses it. Marital privilege doesn't apply to communications made in front of a third party you're shooting at, he rules. I had thought the privilege wouldn't apply in front of a third party you're not shooting at either, but the judge didn't seem inclined to entertain hypotheticals. Irene corroborates the veiled threat Garrett mentioned earlier and adds that her husband also threatened her. According to her, Leon said, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. Who can say what will happen when an angry man owns a gun?" I have to admit, Leon Granger has a certain flair. Next, Steve calls a firearms expert who confirms that the bullet which struck Garrett but failed to penetrate came from Leon's gun. Oddly, Steve doesn't press the expert on this strange anomaly, but Blake picks up the slack during cross-examination. The expert acknowledges that while this kind of occurrence is unusual, a spectacular understatement, it has been known to happen. I can't help but wonder how the rest of the jury will interpret that. Phrases like known to happen and the inevitable is it possible, followed by an affirmative response are really just fancy ways of saying, I seriously doubt it. But lawyers use them as if they carry some profound revelation. The expert also testifies that a shot from a .38 revolver at such close range is typically fatal. Steve seems satisfied with this and decides to rest the prosecution's case. Blake calls Leon Granger to the stand, and things take an interesting turn. Did you shoot Garrett Crowley as he described? Blake asks. Steve's grin spreads wide, as though the case is already in the bag. Kind of, Leon replies calmly. I shot him, the bullet hit him, but it didn't penetrate. Steve's smile falters, curiosity flickering in its place. Did you plan to shoot him in this manner? Yes, I did. Did you intend to harm him? Certainly not. Now Steve's grin is heading south. Can you explain how you managed to hit him without harming him? Leon launches into an explanation that has the entire courtroom captivated. I used .38 special ammunition and modified the cartridges. I removed the bullets, emptied the powder, replaced the primer, and added back a portion of the powder before reassembling them. Then I tested different powder weights to ensure the bullet would exit the muzzle but not penetrate flesh. To simulate ribs, skin, and muscle, I attached thinly sliced pork chops to a wooden frame and experimented with various loads. Once I determined the right charge, I loaded some cartridges and tested them with my Smith & Wesson .357 by shooting at a squirrel. My goal was to ensure the bullet wouldn't penetrate. I hit a squirrel, it squealed and ran off. When I checked the ground where it was standing, I found the bullet intact and saw there was no blood. That confirmed I had the right load. I used the .357 with its 5-inch barrel for accuracy. I wanted to be precise and avoid hitting the wrong place. The courtroom is silent as Leon finishes, his calm delivery leaving jurors and spectators alike stunned. The day I shot him, I used an unmodified shell for the first shot into the bedpost to make them think I was using deadly rounds, Leon explained. The second shot was meant to scare him away. I didn't fire a third round, though even that one wouldn't have penetrated him. The comment I made was to make him believe that if he kept pursuing my wife, I'd kill him. You mentioned using a Smith & Wesson .357, but also talked about .38 ammunition. Can you clarify that? The Smith & Wesson .357 is designed to fire both .357 and .38 ammunition, Leon replied matter-of-factly. You went to great lengths to frighten him. How did you know he'd be there at that time? Leon's tone turned sharp. The idiot was bragging about nailing my wife. He even bragged about when he'd do it again. A bartender overheard and passed it along to me. The jerk actually used the word nail. Anyway, I do a lot of target shooting and am familiar with customizing ammunition. So, I planned it out. I wanted to scare him off, but I also wanted to scare my wife, to make her believe I'd kill her if she cheated again, whether with him or anyone else. Unfortunately, now that I'm being prosecuted, everyone knows I'm a pushover. I guess I'll just have to settle for a divorce. Blake signaled the end of his questioning. While he could have pressed for more details to strengthen the story's credibility, it was a compelling, if far-fetched, narrative. Steve, taking his turn, stepped up with a condescending tone. Mr. Granger, are we really supposed to believe that you deliberately shot Garrett Crowley at point-blank range, but had no intention of harming him? I thought Steve's tone was a huge misstep. His mocking innuendo could be dismantled by a simple yes. Then what? But Blake seemed to have prepared Leon well. Certainly, Leon replied. And if you doubt me, bring in the gun and shoot me with it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, forcing Judge Andy to wield his gavel to restore order. Steve, quick on his feet, recovered better than I would have. It's easy for you to say that, Mr. Granger, knowing full well the judge would never allow such a thing. Leon tilted his head, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Is that a question? Have I completely forgotten the English language, or is Mr. Bishop now testifying without taking an oath or presenting any evidence actually relevant to this case? Steve's tone had been condescending, but next to Leon's sharp retort, it seemed almost gracious. The prosecutor attempted to argue that Leon was mocking him, which he was, and Blake quickly countered that Steve was overstepping boundaries, which he was. Meanwhile, Judge Andy's attempts to intervene were drowned out as both lawyers raised their voices, shouting over one another. Only the gavel's sharp crack finally silenced the chaos. The judge issued a stern warning to both attorneys, who responded with proclamations of repentance, though their sincerity was about as convincing as a bad TV courtroom drama. It was, admittedly, entertaining. Steve wasn't done with Leon, though. He had that familiar look, the one lawyers get when they think they're about to land a knockout question. But often, that look precedes the dumbest question of the trial, and this was no exception. You fired at his chest, but couldn't you just as easily have hit him in the throat? Or somewhere else that might have killed him? Leon didn't miss a beat. At that range, he said with a smirk, I could have circumcised the prick. The judge finally regained control of the courtroom and reminded everyone to refrain from further outbursts. I was watching him when Leon made his remark. A quick puff of air escaped from his lips before he managed to regain his composure. Had he been drinking, it would have likely sprayed both attorneys and possibly the first row of spectators as well. There weren't many witnesses left, and soon enough, I had my chance to decline the nomination for foreman. Mrs. Horowitz led the jury toward our first consensus. Blake was undeniably obnoxious, while Steve Bishop, by comparison, was merely unpleasant. It's so hard to take Blake seriously when you see what a creep he is. I mean, wouldn't he be willing to present any kind of evidence, true or not, that could help his case? I never thought of it that way, said Sarah Reynolds. I hadn't thought of it either, mainly because it seemed like an odd way to approach it. How do I get these people to focus on the actual evidence? I needn't have worried. I think he deserved it, Terry Robinson declared. Hell, I think he would have deserved it even if the bullet hadn't misfired. You don't mess around with married women. If I caught my wife like that, that guy would be lying in a pool of his own blood. Terry wasn't married, but if he ever does get married, his wife better stay faithful. That's not what happened, said Harriet Turner, the librarian. The judge explained this to us. It would have been different if he had walked in on them and shot him in the heat of the moment. But this guy planned it. I don't know if he did all that stuff with the bullets, but he knew when they'd be there, and he had a plan. He could have stopped her if he wanted to. But no, he wanted to shoot the guy. That's completely different. Mr. Cruz nodded in agreement. I don't know what I'd do either. I don't think you really know until it happens. But this guy knew and was waiting for them. That's premeditated. Mrs. Horowitz couldn't resist another jab at Blake. Did you see what he was wearing? I don't have an issue with spending money on clothes. I'm sure you ladies can relate. But his suit and tie were so gaudy. He looked like he'd glow in the dark. Too true, said Harriet Turner. I wouldn't let that man try to sell me life insurance. They went on to discuss Steve Bishop's clothing and demeanor. He dressed well enough, but his contentious attitude might not have gone over as well against a less unpleasant opponent. I was starting to feel sick. What kind of case did you have to present to get these people to focus on the facts? Just when I was starting to lose hope, Vince DeMeo did what a foreman should. He began discussing the case. All that other stuff aside, and no matter how much we might believe a guy or the witnesses he calls, what we know for sure is that Leon knew Garrett had been with his wife before and was going to be with her again. He made some sort of plan, surprised them, and shot the guy. No one disputes that. So, it seems to me what we need to figure out is what Leon was trying to accomplish by shooting him. Did he plan to kill him? Did he plan to scare him? What was his goal? All that bullet stuff doesn't make sense to me, said Raymond Jackson. I work construction, and there's a lot of stuff you've got to know. But what kind of guy knows all that about making bullets? You practically have to go to school for that. I think he just got lucky with that bullet misfire thing. He didn't bring in any evidence about the bullets or anything. He just told us what he wanted us to believe, said Mrs. Horowitz. I kind of think he meant to kill the guy. I'd have meant to kill him, Terry chimed in, his view blunt and simple. Isn't there some kind of compromise? Asked Sarah. They only gave us attempted murder. Why do you think they did that, Jack? Vince asked. So we couldn't find a middle ground. If they'd given us something like assault with the loser victim, we might have convicted on that. But they knew there was no way we would go for attempted murder. They wanted all or nothing because they figured we'd give them all. Well, he had it coming, Harriet said. But that doesn't mean you can just go around shooting anyone you want. If you walk in and catch them, that's one thing. But if you make plans and surprise them, then he meant to do it. I don't even know if this bullet thing he's telling us about is possible, said Mr. Cruz. I think maybe he just made it up. Maybe he read some story in a magazine or something. Why don't we take a vote and see where we stand? Vince suggested. He passed out slips of paper, and we all wrote down guilty or not guilty. Vince started reading them aloud. Guilty, guilty, guilty. He read it 11 times. Then he unfolded the final one. Not guilty. I know this is a secret vote and you don't have to tell us. We can keep talking, but would the not guilty person like to identify themselves and explain why? I raised my hand. Here we go, Mrs. Horowitz said. Big shot lawyer. Does anyone not think the whole issue here is whether he fixed up those bullets so they couldn't hurt Garrett? I asked. There was some murmuring, but no one contradicted me. Well, I think we have conclusive evidence that he was telling the truth, that those bullets couldn't have hurt him. What are you talking about, man? Jason, the bus driver, chimed in for the first time. Nobody but him mentioned those bullets. Why should we take his word for it? Because nobody but him mentioned those bullets. Nobody. I've often found that the most important evidence is the one you don't hear. If you expected to hear it and didn't, something's off. Most people just have that nagging feeling that something's missing. When you finally figure it out, it becomes obvious. Do you remember what the firearms expert said about the bullets left in the gun? They thought for a moment, and Sarah said, he didn't say anything. Exactly. I know you guys don't have legal training, but picture yourself as the prosecutor. Your firearms expert tests the remaining bullets. One is unaltered. He might even tell you that none of the bullets were changed, but let's assume there was only one. Would you have him testify about that? Of course, Sarah answered. Absolutely, Vince said. If there had been even one regular bullet left in that gun, and he had testified to that, would we convict Leon? Yes, said Mr. Cruz. Yes, Raymond agreed. Yes, Terry added. Is Mr. Bishop stupid? I asked. No one responded. Were all the remaining bullets in his gun made by Leon with the special load? Irene Granger leaned forward across the old bar, holding her husband's hands. She looked genuinely concerned for him, devoted even. Maybe she was terrified of him or had simply made up her mind to stand by him, especially considering his expertise as a marksman. I wasn't sure if she had been seduced or if this was just a fleeting mistake, but the state of their marriage was hard to read. She squeezed his hands and sat back down. As we made our way back to the jury box, I couldn't say for sure what everyone else was thinking. I was determined to be more respectful in court, to keep my sarcasm, though it was quite tempting, reserved for family gatherings where it might be more appreciated. I won't hurl personal insults at witnesses or opposing counsel. I will treat everyone in the courtroom with as much respect as I can muster, or fake if necessary, I resolved. We have, Your Honor, Vince responded. I won't call someone a liar unless it's clear they've lied repeatedly. I'll say their statement is untrue, but I'll try to avoid the personal attack. Hate the sin, not the sinner, I told myself. As for the case of the Commonwealth versus Leon Granger, on the charge of attempted murder, what is the jury's verdict? The judge asked. I would speak in a calm, polite tone, trying to sound like a genuinely admirable person, even though I knew if someone continued to lie and evade, I'd lose my temper. But I'd keep it professional, at least for now. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge nodded, accepting the verdict. Leon Granger, still sitting at the defense table, looked stunned but relieved. He glanced over at his wife, Irene, who was gripping his hand tightly, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. When the judge dismissed the jury, she turned to Leon, her eyes welling up, as if the weight of the decision hadn't fully hit her until now. She leaned in, whispering something in his ear that made him smile, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. As we filed out of the courtroom, I could hear the murmur of conversation from the other jurors. It seemed everyone was processing the outcome in their own way. Some of them felt it was the right call, others were still unsure, but all of us had seen the same facts, heard the same testimonies, and ultimately arrived at the same decision. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the weight of the trial finally lifting off my shoulders. The air was fresh, the world a little lighter. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt at peace with the decision. The case had been difficult, the testimonies conflicting, and the emotions raw. But in the end, it was a verdict we'd all come to with careful thought, despite the tensions along the way. My fellow jurors and I exchanged goodbyes. I caught Vince's eye and gave him a small nod of respect. We'd been through something intense together. He returned the nod, and I could tell he appreciated the clarity we had found, even if the case itself was murky. As I walked to my car, I thought about the future, my family, my friends, the next thing on my to-do list. But I also thought about Leon and Irene, and what the future would hold for them now. I hoped it would be a better one. Everyone deserved a second chance, a chance to make things right. Maybe they would. Maybe not. But that was a question for another day. The verdict was done, the courtroom closed, and life, as it always does, moved forward. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.